The whole town watched as the lonely woman everyone overlooked stepped onto the dance floor with the one cowboy nobody expected to choose her. The fiddle screamed through the harvest hall as Caleb Dawson crossed the room, dust still clinging to his coat from the mountain trail. Nora Whitfield stood frozen while whispers faded around her, unable to understand why the most respected rancher in Red Creek was reaching for her hand. But what he knew about her was something the town had never seen. Stay with us and discover the story behind this unforgettable choice. The Red Creek Harvest Festival always arrived with the first cold winds of October. For one evening, the dust-covered streets of the Wyoming Territory town looked almost welcoming. Lanterns hung from wooden posts along Main Street. The smell of roasted corn, fresh bread, and coffee drifted from the open doors of the church hall. Ranch hands who spent most days covered in mud and cattle dust came wearing their cleanest shirts. Women pinned their hair carefully and brought out dresses saved for special occasions. It was the kind of night when people wanted to forget how hard life could be. Nora Whitfield stood near the far wall of the dance hall, holding a small cup of cider between both hands. She had helped prepare half the food being served that night. She had baked the apple pies cooling on the back table. She had sewn the loose buttons on two children's coats before the festival began. She had spent the afternoon helping old Mrs. Carter arrange flowers near the church windows. But when the music started and the couples moved onto the wooden floor, Nora became almost invisible. She was used to that. People noticed her when they needed something. A loaf of bread, a torn sleeve repaired, a warm meal delivered during a snowstorm. But when it came to dances, conversations, and invitations, most people suddenly remembered somewhere else they needed to be. Nora looked across the room. Young women laughed near the musicians, their skirts moving as they turned beneath the lantern light. Men walked over with nervous smiles, asking for dances and offering compliments. Nora lowered her eyes to the cider in her hands. The cup was nearly empty. She had told herself she would stay only an hour, long enough to prove she was not hiding away, long enough to remind herself that she was still part of the town. Then she would return to her small farmhouse outside Red Creek, light the stove and spend the evening reading beside the window. That had always been enough. At least that was what she told herself. Nora Whitfield, the voice came from behind her. She turned and saw Benjamin Reed standing there. Benjamin was the son of Samuel Reed, one of the wealthiest cattle owners in the territory. He wore a dark jacket, polished boots, and the kind of confident smile that came from never hearing the word no. Several people nearby noticed him. Their conversations became quieter. Nora offered a polite smile, Benjamin. He looked her over for a moment. Not the way Caleb Dawson would later look at her. Not with curiosity, not with respect, like he was examining something that did not belong. "I heard you were helping with the festival again," he said. "I was glad to help." "Of course you were." The words sounded harmless at first, but something in his voice made Nora's fingers tighten around the cup. Benjamin glanced toward the dance floor. "You ever think about joining them?" Nora followed his eyes. "I suppose I do." He gave a small laugh, not a kind one. "Nora, some things are better left alone." The people standing nearby began listening. Nora felt it before she saw it. That familiar shift, the moment when a room quietly decides someone has become entertainment. "I don't understand," she said. Benjamin leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to make everyone nearby hear. "You are a good woman. Everyone knows that." Nora remained still, but not every woman is meant to be chosen. The words landed softly. That made them worse. A few people looked away. A few smiled. Someone near the drink table let out a quiet laugh. Nora felt warmth rise into her face. She had heard cruel words before. People were not always careful with someone they believed would never fight back. But hearing them here, surrounded by music and lanterns and families pretending to celebrate kindness, hurt more than she expected. Benjamin continued, "You should be thankful people appreciate what you do." Nora looked at him. For a moment, she wanted to answer. She wanted to tell him that being useful was not the same as being valued. She wanted to tell him that a person's worth was not measured by whether someone asked them to dance. But years of swallowing words had made silence easier, so she'd simply placed her empty cup on the table. "I think I will go home," Benjamin smiled, as if he had won something. Probably for the best. Nora turned away. The music continued. A fiddle played near the front of the room. Couples spun beneath the lanterns. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked her to stay. She reached the door just as the sound of horse hooves came from outside. At first, no one paid attention. Red Creek heard horses every day, but these steps were different. Slow, heavy, steady, the kind of rhythm that made people look up without knowing why. The doors opened. Cold evening air moved through the hall. A tall man stood in the doorway. Dust covered his coat from the long road. His hat sat low over tired eyes. His boots carried the marks of days spent riding through rough country. Caleb Dawson had returned from the northern cattle trail. Everyone in Red Creek knew him. He owned one of the largest ranches near the mountains. Men respected his judgment. Ranchers listened when he spoke. Even those who disliked him admitted he had built everything he owned with his own hands. But Caleb Dawson was not a man who enjoyed town gatherings. He rarely attended dances, rarely stayed for conversations, and he had never been known as a man searching for companionship. The room changed when he entered. People moved aside. Benjamin Reed straightened his jacket. Several women looked toward Caleb with interest, but Caleb did not look at them. His eyes moved across the room and stopped. On Nora. For a moment, she wondered if he was simply looking past her. That happened often. She lowered her gaze. Then she heard his boots moving across the wooden floor. Closer, closer, until they stopped in front of her. Nora Whitfield. Her heart gave a small, uncertain beat. "Mr. Dawson." Caleb removed his hat. The gesture was simple, respectful. "I believe I owe you a dance." Nora looked behind him, then back at him. "I'm sorry?" A few people nearby stopped talking. Caleb's expression barely changed. The final dance. The room became strangely quiet. Nora glanced toward the dance floor. "I don't think anyone asked me, I know." Those two words surprised her. He knew, he had seen. She studied his face, searching for a joke. There was none, only a calm seriousness that made her unsure what to do. "Mr. Dawson, you don't have to, I know." Again, quiet, certain. He extended his hand, not impatiently, not like he expected her to accept, like he was giving her a choice. Around them, whispers started. Benjamin Reed stared from across the room. Someone near the wall muttered something Nora could not hear. She looked down at Caleb's hand, a hand marked by work, a hand that had probably held reins, repaired fences, and carried heavy loads through mountain weather. Then she looked back at his face. Why her? The question sat between them. She did not say it, but somehow Caleb seemed to understand. "You don't have to dance if you don't want to," he said quietly. That was what surprised her most, not the invitation, the choice. For years, people had told Nora what she should accept, what she should be grateful for, what she should expect. But this man was simply asking. The fiddle players began another song, slow, gentle. Nora placed her hand in his. The room went silent. Caleb led her onto the floor. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple walk through a room that had spent years making her feel like she should stand against the wall. His hand rested carefully, respectfully. He did not hold her like he was proving something. He danced with her like she belonged there. Nora looked around. The same people who had laughed moments earlier were now watching without a word. Benjamin Reed looked away first. For the first time that night, Nora stopped wondering what everyone else saw. She listened to the music, felt the wooden floor beneath her feet, saw the lantern light moving across Caleb's face, and wondered what kind of man walked into a crowded room and chose the person everyone else ignored, because Caleb Dawson was not supposed to notice her. Nobody in Red Creek thought he would, and yet there he was, dancing with Nora Whitfield in front of everyone, as if she had always been the one worth choosing. That was the sight people in Red Creek carried with them long after the Harvest Festival ended. By the next morning, the story had already traveled farther than the smell of fresh coffee from the town diner. Some people said Caleb Dawson had surprised everyone. Some said he had simply been tired after his cattle drive and made an unusual decision. Others whispered that Nora Whitfield must have done something to catch the attention of a man who had ignored every woman in the territory for years. Nora heard those whispers before she even reached the general store. She had gone into town to pick up flour, lamp oil, and a small bag of coffee beans. The list was written neatly on a folded piece of paper tucked inside her coat pocket. She had always liked lists. Lists were simple. They did not judge. They did not change their minds. A pound of flour was always a pound of flour. A broken hinge was always a broken hinge. People were much harder to understand. Inside the store, the wooden floor creaked beneath her boots as she placed her order. "Morning," said Mr. Collins behind the counter. "Morning." He measured the flour carefully, pouring it into a brown paper sack and tying the top with string. "You staying for the church meeting tomorrow?" "I believe so." "Good." Mrs. Carter said she needs help arranging the tables. Nora smiled slightly. Of course she did. There was always something to repair, something to prepare, something someone needed from her. She paid the few coins and placed the receipt carefully into her pocket. As she turned toward the door, she noticed the conversation near the window had stopped. 3 women stood there holding baskets. They were not looking directly at her. They did not need to. Nora had learned long ago how to recognize when a room had changed. She stepped outside before their voices became clear. The morning air was colder than the evening before. A thin layer of frost covered the wooden railings outside the shops. Horses shifted near the hitching posts, their breath rising in small clouds. Nora pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the road leading home. She told herself she did not care. She had spent 32 years learning not to care. But when she reached her farmhouse, she set the flour down on the kitchen table a little harder than she intended. The small house sat on a quiet patch of land outside Red Creek. It was not large, 2 rooms downstairs, a narrow bedroom, a kitchen with an iron stove that sometimes smoked when the wind came from the west. But it was hers. The garden behind the house was already preparing for winter. The last tomatoes had been gathered weeks earlier. The rows of vegetables were covered with straw to protect the soil. Nora removed her coat and hung it near the door. Then she began working. Work had always been easier than thinking. She kneaded bread dough while sunlight moved across the kitchen floor. She cleaned the shelves. She repaired a loose button on her winter dress. Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door. Nora wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. A young boy stood outside. "Miss Whitfield?" It was Thomas Miller, the youngest child of the blacksmith. "What happened?" The boy held up his hand. A small cut ran across his palm from a broken piece of wood. "My mother said you might know what to do." Nora immediately stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze." She washed the wound carefully with clean water, wrapped it with cloth, and gave him a small jar of salve she had made from herbs grown in her garden. "Keep it covered tonight," she said. Thomas nodded. "Thank you, you are welcome." After he left, Nora stood at the doorway watching him run back toward town. This was her life, small moments, small kindnesses. A person could spend years giving pieces of themselves away until nobody remembered there was a whole person underneath. 3 days after the festival, Caleb Dawson rode past her farmhouse. At first, Nora thought she imagined it. The sound of horse hooves on the dirt road made her look up from the fence she was repairing. Caleb slowed his horse near the gate. He removed his hat. "Morning, Miss Whitfield." Nora rested one hand on the fence post. "Mr. Dawson." His eyes moved toward the basket beside her. "Delivering something? Just repairing the fence." He looked at the damaged section. "You do that yourself?" Nora glanced at the broken wood. "Most things around here need doing." Caleb nodded. There was the pause. Not an uncomfortable one, just quiet. Most people rushed to fill silence. Caleb seemed comfortable letting it exist. "I was wondering if you had any more of that bread you brought to the festival." Nora looked surprised. The bread, the cinnamon one. A small smile touched her face. "You remembered that?" "I did." She looked toward the house. "I might have some left." "How much?" "Enough for a loaf." Caleb reached for his coat pocket. Nora shook her head. "No." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "No. You helped my neighbor's cattle get back on the road last winter, Mrs. Miller told me." Caleb looked away for a moment. "That was nothing. Then consider this nothing too." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb nodded. "Fair enough." She went inside and returned with a wrapped loaf. He handed her a few coins anyway. Nora looked down. "You didn't listen. I rarely do." The answer surprised a quiet laugh from her, a real one. Short, unexpected. Noticed, but he did not mention it. He simply placed the bread in his saddlebag. "Thank you, you're welcome." He tipped his hat and rode away. Nora watched until he disappeared beyond the trees. She told herself it meant nothing. A cowboy buying bread was only a cowboy buying bread. But she found herself looking toward the road more often than before. Not waiting, just noticing. Meanwhile, at the Dawson Ranch high in the mountains, Caleb sat alone at his kitchen table that evening. The cabin was warm from the stove. A tin coffee mug sat near his hand. The room looked exactly as it always had. The same chair, the same tools hanging near the door, the same quiet. But the silence felt different. His sister Margaret noticed when she visited the next morning. She placed a basket of supplies on the table and studied him. "You smiled yesterday." Caleb looked up. "No, I didn't. You did. I did not." Margaret removed her gloves. "Caleb, I have known you since you were a boy. You have many talents. Lying is not one of them." He looked back at his coffee. Margaret softened slightly. "You went to the festival, I did, and you danced." He said nothing. "With Nora Whitfield." The silence answered for him. Margaret sat across from him. "Caleb." "What? People are talking. They always are. That does not mean you should ignore it." Caleb looked toward the window. The mountain wind moved through the pine trees. "I did not dance with her because of what people think." Margaret studied his face. "Then why?" Caleb did not answer immediately, because he did not have a simple answer. He had seen Nora standing alone in that crowded room. He had seen the way she held herself together while people decided what she deserved. He had seen kindness in someone who had every reason to become bitter. Finally, he said, she was the only person there who looked like she did not need anything from anyone. Margaret was quiet. Then she looked down at her hands. Maybe that is exactly why she does. Caleb looked at her. But Margaret only picked up her basket. Think about it. After she left, Caleb remained by the window. Far below, the road stretched toward Red Creek, a road he had traveled hundreds of times. Yet for the first time in years, he found himself wondering who might be standing beside it. Back at the farmhouse, Nora closed her kitchen door that night. She placed the empty bread basket on the shelf. Then she stopped. For a moment, she touched the edge of the basket where Caleb's hand had rested earlier. A small thing, a meaningless thing. That was what she told herself. But she smiled before she turned away, and she had not done that in a long while. For reasons Nora could not explain, that small moment stayed with her, not the dance, not the whispers, not even the look on Benjamin Reed's face when Caleb Dawson crossed the room. It was the simple things she remembered. The way Caleb had waited for her answer. The way he had never looked around to see who was watching. The way he had accepted her bread without making her feel like she was doing him a favor. Nora had spent years learning the difference between being needed and being valued. Caleb Dawson was the first person in a long time who seemed interested in the second, but life in Red Creek did not slow down because one cowboy had asked one woman to dance. The next morning, the town returned to its usual rhythm. Wagons rolled down Main Street. The blacksmith's hammer rang from sunrise until evening. Ranch hands carried supplies from the general store. People worked because the land demanded it. At the Dawson Ranch, miles beyond town near the foothills of the mountains, Caleb Dawson started his day before the sun reached the peaks. He stepped outside his cabin carrying a tin mug of coffee. The air was sharp, cold enough that his breath showed. The ranch spread across the valley below him, hundreds of acres of grassland and rocky hills that had taken him years to build. The fences needed checking, the cattle needed moving, the winter stores needed counting. There was always something. There had always been something. That was how Caleb preferred it. Work did not ask questions. Work did not leave. Work did not remind him of what he had lost. Inside the ranch house, a small framed photograph sat on a wooden shelf. He rarely touched it, but every morning, before leaving, his eyes found it for a moment. A life that had once been full, a home that had once carried another voice. Years ago, Caleb had believed he would grow old surrounded by family. Then winter came, and after that, he learned some things could disappear faster than a candle in the wind. He never spoke about it, not to the ranch hands, not to Margaret, not even to himself. People in Red Creek called him many things, a hard man, a quiet man, a man married to his land. Most of them were not wrong. Margaret Dawson arrived at the ranch just after breakfast. Her horse stopped near the front gate, and Caleb looked up from repairing a broken fence post. His sister climbed down carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "You forget meals when you're busy," she said. Caleb leaned the hammer against the fence. "I ate." Margaret looked toward the cabin. "The same way you always eat?" He said nothing. She smiled faintly. Inside the basket were fresh rolls, canned peaches, and a small jar of jam. "You don't have to keep bringing food, I know. Then why do you?" "Because if I don't, you'll convince yourself coffee counts as breakfast." Caleb almost smiled. "Almost," Margaret noticed. "You are different." "No, I am not. You are." Caleb poured himself more coffee. Margaret watched him carefully. "You went to town twice this week." "I had business." "You bought bread?" "That was business?" She raised an eyebrow. Caleb looked away. Margaret had known him too long. She knew every silence had meaning. "Caleb." "What? Are you interested in her?" He did not answer. The wind moved through the trees outside. Finally, he set the mug down. "I don't know." That answer surprised Margaret more than a yes would have. Because Caleb Dawson always knew. He knew when to buy cattle, when to sell, when a storm was coming, when a fence would not survive another winter. But with Nora Whitfield, he was uncertain, and uncertainty was something he had avoided for years. "She is a good woman," Margaret said. Caleb looked at her. "You barely know her." "I know enough." Margaret folded the cloth over the empty part of the basket. "I know she helped my neighbor's child when the clinic was closed last month. I know she brings food to old people who cannot cook for themselves. I know she fixed Mrs. Miller's roof leak before the first snow." Caleb listened. "People like Nora," Margaret continued, "are easy to overlook because they are always busy helping someone else." He looked toward the valley. "I don't want to hurt her." Margaret's expression softened. "Then don't." Simple words. But they stayed with him. 2 days later, Caleb found himself riding toward Red Creek. He told himself he needed supplies. Salt, rope, a new set of gloves. That was true. But it was not the only reason. When he reached the town, he tied his horse near the general store. He saw Nora before he entered. She was standing beside a wagon, speaking with an elderly man whose hands shook while trying to unload a heavy sack. Without hesitation, Nora stepped forward. "I can help with that." The man looked embarrassed. "I've got it. I know you do," she smiled. "But you don't have to prove it." Caleb watched from across the street. She did not help because people were watching. She did not help because she wanted praise. She helped because she saw someone struggling. The same thing she always did. A small boy ran past them chasing a wooden wheel. The wheel rolled into the street. A horse pulling a wagon turned the corner too quickly. Everything happened in seconds. The boy froze. The wagon driver pulled the reins. The horse stopped hard. Before anyone could react, Nora moved. She grabbed the boy's coat and pulled him safely back. The wooden wheel rolled into the dirt. The street became quiet. The boy's mother rushed over, holding him tightly. Thank goodness, Nora only brushed dust from the child's sleeve. "He's all right." The mother thanked her again and again. Nora shook her head. It was nothing, but Caleb had seen it. It was never nothing. That evening, he stopped at Nora's farmhouse. The sky was turning orange behind the hills. She was carrying a basket of vegetables from her garden when she noticed him at the gate. "Mr. Dawson." Nora. The use of her first name surprised both of them. Neither mentioned it. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You aren't." She placed the basket down. "Is something wrong?" "No." A pause. "I wanted to ask about something." She waited. Caleb looked toward the garden. "You grow most of your own food?" "Most of it." "Why?" Nora looked at him. "Because I can." A small smile appeared. "And because buying everything in town gets expensive." Caleb nodded. "That makes sense." Another silence. Then he said, "I saw what happened today." Nora knew immediately. "The boy?" "Yes, he was frightened. So were you." She looked away. "I was fine." Caleb did not argue. He simply stood there. That was something she was beginning to notice about him. He never pushed. He waited. "You always do that?" he asked. "What?" "Help people before thinking about yourself." Nora looked down at her hands, hands marked by years of work. "I don't know any other way." For a moment, Caleb said nothing. Then he nodded. "I understand." Nora looked back at him. Something about the way he said it felt different. Not sympathy, not pity, understanding. Few minutes later, Caleb rode away. Nora watched him disappear down the road. She did not know why a quiet visit from a quiet man could make an ordinary evening feel different. She did not know why she found herself listening for horse hooves after sunset. And Caleb Dawson did not know why, after years of convincing himself that loneliness was easier. He was beginning to look forward to a road leading somewhere other than his own ranch. For the first time in many years, the man who had stopped believing in new beginnings wondered if he had been wrong. The thought bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Caleb Dawson was a man who trusted facts. A broken fence post could be replaced. A sick cow could be treated. A bad season could be survived if a man worked hard enough. But feelings were harder to manage. They did not follow rules. They appeared when they were least expected. And lately, they seemed to appear whenever he heard the sound of Nora Whitfield's voice. A week passed after the harvest festival. Caleb told himself he had been busy. The northern pasture needed checking. The winter feed needed counting. One of the ranch gates near the creek had loosened after a strong wind. All of that was true. But twice during those days, he found himself riding the longer road toward Red Creek. The first time, he stopped at the general store. The second time, he stopped at Nora's farmhouse. Neither visit had a good excuse, at least not one he admitted. On a gray afternoon, Caleb arrived at the small farmhouse carrying a worn leather pouch. Nora was outside hanging laundry near the back porch. The wind moved through the cottonwood trees, lifting the corners of the white sheets. She looked up when she heard the horse. Mr. Dawson. Caleb removed his hat. Nora. Again, her name came easily now, she noticed. She did not mention it. I hope I am not disturbing you. You aren't. She looked at the pouch in his hand. Something wrong? No. A pause. I was wondering if you had any more bread. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then a small smile appeared. You rode all the way here for bread? Caleb glanced toward the road behind him. Seems that way. The smile stayed a second longer. I have some inside. The kitchen was warm from the stove. A small iron pot sat over the fire. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the room. Caleb stepped inside, but stopped near the doorway. He never entered another person's home without invitation. Nora noticed. You can sit. He nodded and took the wooden chair near the table. The room was simple. A small shelf filled with jars, a stack of folded cloth near the sewing basket, a few books beside the window. Nothing expensive, nothing meant to impress, but everything had a place. Nora wrapped a loaf of bread in paper and tied it with string. That will last a few days. Caleb accepted it. I appreciate it. You always pay too much. He looked down at the coins he had placed on the table. I do, you do. I didn't notice. For the first time, Nora saw something different in him. Not the distant ranch owner, not the man everyone respected from a distance. Just a man sitting in a small kitchen, unsure what to say. She looked away before he noticed her watching. How is the ranch? Busy. That usually means trouble. Caleb nodded slightly. Sometimes, most days. That made her laugh quietly. The sound surprised both of them. Caleb looked toward the window. Outside, the wind pushed dry leaves across the yard. For a moment, neither spoke. It was a comfortable silence, one Nora was not used to sharing. When Caleb finally stood, he placed the bread carefully into his saddlebag. Thank you, you are welcome. He reached the door, then stopped. Nora. She looked up. Yes? He seemed to think about his next words. Then he simply said, Have a good evening. She smiled. You too, Mr. Dawson. After he left, Nora stood by the window longer than she intended. She watched him disappear down the road, then she returned to her work. But she found herself humming while she cleaned. Something she had not done in years. The next few weeks changed quietly. There was no grand announcement, no sudden moment when the entire town understood. It happened in small pieces. Caleb began stopping by more often. Sometimes he bought bread. Sometimes he asked if she knew where he could find supplies in town. Once he brought an injured young calf from the ranch and asked if she knew anything that could help. Nora examined the animal carefully. You should have brought him to the clinic. The clinic was closed. That doesn't mean you should bring every problem to me. Caleb looked at her. I don't. She raised an eyebrow. You do. A small smile crossed his face. Maybe? She shook her head. But she helped anyway. The calf recovered. The ranch hands noticed, especially the older workers who had spent years watching Caleb carry every burden alone. One evening, one of them said, Never seen him visit town this much. Another man laughed. Maybe he finally remembered there are people outside his ranch, but not everyone found it amusing. At the Red Creek Diner, Samuel Reed sat near the window drinking coffee. He watched Caleb cross the street beside Nora. The two of them were not holding hands. They were not doing anything that would give anyone a reason to complain. They were simply walking together. That was enough. Samuel placed his coffee cup down. His son Benjamin sat across from him. You still think he is serious? Benjamin looked through the window. I don't know. Samuel's expression hardened. Caleb Dawson does not make foolish decisions. No. Which means either he has lost his judgment. He paused. Or there is something about that woman we don't understand. Benjamin looked uncomfortable. People already talk. People always talk. Samuel leaned back, but sometimes they need a reason. The reason came sooner than anyone expected. A few days later, Nora went into town to buy medicine for Mrs. Carter. The small clinic near the church had received a shipment of supplies, and Nora wanted to pick up a bottle of fever medicine before winter arrived. When she left the clinic, she found Caleb standing near the hitching post. "I was looking for you." She stopped. "Is something wrong?" "No." He glanced at the small package in her hand. "Helping someone again?" Nora looked down. "Mrs. Carter's been coughing." Caleb nodded. Before he could say more, Benjamin Reed stepped out from the diner doorway. He had two friends beside him, the kind of men who laughed louder when they had an audience. "Well," Benjamin said, "Nora Whitfield and Caleb Dawson." The street became quieter. Nora felt it immediately. Caleb did too. Benjamin smiled. Red Creek has been wondering how long this would last. Caleb's face remained calm. "Wondering about what?" Benjamin shrugged. "You know." He looked at Nora. "People talk." Nora lowered her eyes. "Benjamin," but he continued, "everyone knows Caleb is a good man. Maybe too good sometimes." Caleb stepped forward slightly, not threatening, just enough. "Choose your next words carefully," Benjamin noticed. The smile faded a little, but pride kept him standing. "I am only saying what everyone else thinks." Nora looked around. She saw the faces, some curious, some uncomfortable, some agreeing silently. The old feeling returned. That feeling of standing in a room where everyone had already decided who she was. Before she could leave, Caleb spoke. "Then everyone else can say it to my face." The street went still. Benjamin blinked. Caleb looked directly at him. "Nora has helped more people in this town than most men I know." Nobody moved. "She does not need anyone's permission to stand beside me." Nora looked at him, not because he defended her, because he did it without making her feel weak. He was not speaking for someone who could not speak. He was standing beside someone who had always been able to. Benjamin looked away. For once, he had nothing to say. Caleb turned toward Nora. "Are you ready to go?" She nodded. Together, they walked back toward the horses. The whole town watched. But this time, Nora did not feel like she was shrinking. She felt like she was standing exactly where she belonged. And somewhere behind them, Samuel Reed watched from the diner window. His expression did not show anger, only calculation. He had just learned something important. Caleb Dawson was not simply spending time with Nora Whitfield. He cared about her, and that made her much more valuable than anyone in Red Creek had realized. Samuel Reed watched from the diner window as Caleb Dawson walked beside Nora Whitfield through the center of town. He watched the way Caleb slowed his steps to match hers. He watched how Nora no longer looked down when people stared. And he watched something else, something he understood better than most men. Caleb Dawson was a man who protected what mattered to him. Samuel had spent years studying people like Caleb, men who built their lives around land and reputation, men who believed they could control every piece of their world if they worked hard enough. But Samuel also knew something else. A man could lose control faster over a person than over a piece of land. And Nora Whitfield had become that person. By the time winter began creeping down from the mountains, Caleb's ranch faced a problem no amount of hard work could easily fix. The summer had been unusually dry. The creek that usually fed the southern pasture ran lower each week. The grass that once stretched across the valley had turned pale and brittle. Cattle moved slower. The ranch hands noticed. Caleb noticed most of all. Every morning he studied the land. Every evening he checked the numbers in his ledgers, The pages on his desk showed the truth clearly. Feed costs were rising, water supplies were shrinking, the cattle were losing weight. A ranch could survive a bad month, it could survive a bad season. But if a man ignored the signs long enough, the land would make the decision for him. One cold morning, Caleb stood near the western pasture fence with his foreman, Walter Briggs. Walter was a man in his 60s who had worked cattle longer than Caleb had owned the ranch. He removed his hat and wiped his forehead. Never seen the ground this dry this early. Caleb looked across the field. Neither have I. We could move more cattle north. North pasture won't hold them. Walter nodded. Both men stared at the cracked earth. There was no easy answer. Caleb hated problems without answers. That afternoon, Nora arrived at the ranch carrying a basket. She had brought bread, jars of preserved vegetables, and a small bundle of herbs for one of the ranch hands who had caught a cold. She stopped near the gate when she saw Caleb standing beside the barn. His coat was open despite the cold. His gloves were tucked into his belt. He looked tired, not just from work, from carrying too much of it alone. "You look like you have been arguing with the land all day," Nora said. Caleb looked over. A faint smile appeared. "Maybe I have." She stepped closer. "What happened?" He glanced toward the pasture. The drought. Nora followed his eyes. The valley stretched wide before them. For several moments, she said nothing. Caleb noticed that. Most people gave opinions quickly. Nora watched first. She always watched first. "You have been feeding the western herd from the same section all summer," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Yes." "Why?" "Because that pasture has always held the strongest grass," Nora nodded, "before this year." The words were simple, but Caleb heard the meaning. He crossed his arms. "What are you thinking?" Nora hesitated, not because she was unsure, because she knew exactly what it meant to question a man about something he had built. "I think the land is telling you it needs time." Caleb looked toward the field. "What would you do?" Nora walked closer to the fence. She touched the rough wood post. "My father used to say land remembers." Caleb listened. "People think they own it," she continued. "But really, they are borrowing it." She pointed toward the western slope. "That ground needs rest. The cattle have taken too much from it." Caleb looked at the pasture, then back at her. "You're saying I should move the herd. I'm saying you should listen before the land stops giving you anything." The words stayed between them. Caleb was quiet. For years, men had come to him asking for advice. Banks, ranchers, workers. Nobody had stood beside his fence and calmly told him he might be wrong. But Nora was not challenging him. She was trying to help. "How did you learn this?" he asked. She shrugged slightly. "Growing up on a farm." "You never told me much about your family." Nora looked away. "There isn't much to tell." Caleb noticed the change, the small closing of a door. He did not push. Instead, he said, "Show me." Nora looked back. "What? The pasture?" A few hours later, Caleb and Nora rode across the western field. She sat comfortably in the saddle, not like someone trying to impress him, like someone who had spent years around animals and open land. They stopped near a dry creek bed. Nora climbed down and knelt beside the soil. She pressed her fingers into the dirt. "The water used to run here." Caleb looked around. It did, but not enough anymore. She pointed toward the lower ground. "Water is still moving underneath. It just isn't reaching the places you need it." Caleb studied the area. "You are certain?" "No." She stood. "I am paying attention." That answer stayed with him because it sounded exactly like Nora. No pride, no need to be right, just careful observation. Over the next week, Caleb made changes. He moved sections of the herd. He repaired an old water channel near the lower pasture. he allowed the western field to recover. Some ranch hands questioned him at first, but Walter Briggs watched quietly. Then one morning, he approached Caleb near the barn. "Your friend was right." Caleb looked up from repairing a saddle strap. "Walter, I know. You don't like admitting anyone else has a good idea." Caleb almost smiled. Almost. Walter nodded toward the valley. The cattle are already doing better." Caleb looked out across the ranch. The change was small, but it was there. The grass was beginning to return. The animals moved easier. A problem that had seemed impossible had started to loosen, and everyone knew who had seen it first. The ranch hands who once ignored Nora now greeted her when she arrived. One afternoon, she brought lunch for the workers. A young ranch hand named Eli removed his hat. "Miss Whitfield." Nora stopped. "Yes? I wanted to thank you. For what?" He looked toward the fields. "For helping us keep this place going." Nora smiled softly. "I didn't do it alone," Eli nodded. "But you noticed what nobody else did." Later that evening, Caleb found Nora sitting near the porch of the ranch house. The sunset painted the mountains gold. He stood beside her for a moment before sitting down. "I owe you an apology." Nora looked surprised. "For what? For not listening sooner." She looked at this valley. "You listened when it mattered." Caleb was quiet. Then he said, "Most people come to me because they want something." Nora glanced at him. "I don't know." The answer came quickly. She waited. Caleb looked toward the ranch. "You came here and saw a problem before you saw what it could do for you." Nora looked down at her hands. "I only did what anyone would do." Caleb shook his head. "No." A quiet moment passed. "You really believe that, don't you?" She looked at him. "Believe what?" "That what you do is ordinary." Nora did not answer. The wind moved through the grass. Neither of them spoke, but something between them had changed. Not because of a grand promise, not because of a perfect moment, because Caleb had finally seen something the town had ignored. Nora Whitfield was not a woman waiting for someone to give her value. She had carried value with her all along. And now the entire Dawson Ranch was beginning to see it too. But far away in Red Creek, Samuel Reed sat at his desk with a different kind of plan. A letter rested beside his coffee cup. A map of Caleb Dawson's land lay open before him. Samuel tapped his finger against the paper. The ranch had survived the drought. Caleb had survived another challenge, and Nora Whitfield had become the reason why. That was a problem, because Samuel Reed had spent years waiting for the right moment to take the Dawson land. And now, before he could do that, he would have to remove the one person who had made Caleb stronger. Samuel Reed was not a man who rushed. He had built his fortune by waiting for droughts that forced smaller ranchers to sell, waiting for debts that grew too large, waiting for men to make mistakes when they were tired, desperate, or proud. The Dawson Ranch had survived longer than Samuel expected. The drought should have weakened Caleb. The poor cattle numbers should have forced him to borrow money. The failing pastures should have opened the door. Instead, Caleb Dawson had made changes, and everyone in Red Creek knew who had helped him see what he had missed. Nora Whitfield. Samuel sat in his office behind the Reed Ranch headquarters, looking over the papers spread across his desk. A map, a few land records, a list of water rights along the valley. The Dawson property sat exactly where Samuel wanted it. The mountain springs running beneath those acres could support his expanding cattle operation for decades. But Caleb would never sell. Not now, not with Nora beside him. Samuel leaned back in his chair. People could be stubborn about land. They could be stubborn about money. But love was different. Love made people careless, and Samuel knew exactly where to begin. At first, the rumors were small, almost harmless. A comment at the general store, A whisper near the church steps, a sentence spoken quietly enough that the person repeating it could pretend they were only concerned. I heard Nora has been spending a lot of time at the Dawson Ranch. Well, someone has to look after Caleb. Is that really what she is doing? The words moved through Red Creek, the way smoke moved through an open window, slowly, quietly, until suddenly, everything smelled like it. Nora noticed the change before anyone admitted it. The women who once asked her for recipes became shorter in conversation. The people who came to her farmhouse for help suddenly seemed embarrassed to ask. Even Clara, her younger cousin, became quieter. One afternoon, Nora found Clara standing outside the Whitfield farmhouse. The girl held a small basket in her hands. Nora. Nora looked up from trimming herbs. Clara. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara stepped closer. I brought the sewing supplies you asked for, thank you. Nora reached for the basket. Clara did not let go immediately. There are things being said. Nora's hand stopped. What kind of things? Clara looked uncomfortable. The town thinks, she paused. Nora waited. People think you are changing, Caleb. The words were softer than the rumors, but they still hurt. Nora looked back toward the garden. I see. Clara lowered her eyes. I don't believe everything they say. Nora looked at her. But you believe some of it. Clara did not answer, and that was answer enough. Nora took the basket. Thank you for bringing these. Clara nodded, then she left. Nora watched her cousin walk away. The garden around her was quiet. The same garden where she had planted seeds every spring. The same place where she had worked through lonely mornings and cold evenings. She had always known some people would never see her differently, but she had not expected it to happen after she finally started feeling seen. At the Dawson Ranch, Caleb noticed the change too. The ranch hands were still respectful, the cattle were still improving, but the world outside the ranch fence had shifted. One morning, Walter Briggs brought the mail from town. Among the letters was a small receipt from the feed supplier and a notice about upcoming winter deliveries. Caleb opened each one carefully, then Walter cleared his throat. You heard what folks are saying? Caleb looked up. Walter hesitated. That alone told Caleb enough. What happened? Walter placed his gloves on the table. People are talking about Miss Whitfield. Caleb's expression changed. What about her? Walter looked away. Nothing worth repeating. Then why mention it? The older man sighed. Because sometimes words become problems before they become truth. Caleb folded the letter in his hand. Who started it? Walter did not answer. He did not need to. Caleb knew. A few days later, Caleb rode into Red Creek with Nora. She needed supplies from the general store. He needed replacement parts for a broken wagon wheel. It was an ordinary trip. At least it should have been. The two of them walked down Main Street together, not touching, not trying to prove anything, just walking. But the conversations around them became quieter. Nora noticed. Caleb noticed too. Outside the general store, a woman named Abigail Carter stepped aside when Nora approached. The movement was small, almost invisible, but Nora saw it. Caleb saw it too. His jaw tightened. Nora? She looked at him. It's all right. No. His voice was calm, but firm. It isn't. Before she could answer, Samuel Reed stepped out from the doorway of the bank. He wore a clean black coat and carried himself like a man who owned every street he walked on. Caleb. Caleb turned. Samuel. Samuel glanced at Nora, then back at Caleb. I hear your ranch is doing well. It is. Good. A pause. Always good to see a man recover after making questionable decisions. Nora looked at him. Caleb's voice remained steady. Say what you came to say. Samuel smiled slightly. Nothing more than concern. Concern? Yes, he adjusted his gloves. People are wondering if you are making choices based on business or something else. Nora felt the words before they fully landed. Samuel was not talking about the ranch. He was talking about her. Caleb stepped forward. That is enough. Samuel looked surprised. Not because Caleb was angry, because Caleb was defending her without hesitation. Caleb, I am only saying what others are thinking. No. Caleb looked directly at him. You are saying what you want others to think. The street became silent. Samuel's expression changed slightly, just for a moment, then he smiled. Careful, Caleb. He looked toward Nora. People might believe you are protecting something fragile. Nora's face tightened. Before Caleb could respond, she spoke. I'm not fragile. Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard. Samuel looked at her. Nora continued. I have lived through enough to know the difference. Caleb looked at her. There was no fear in her voice, only dignity. Samuel said nothing. He simply tipped his hat and walked away. But the damage was already done. That evening, Nora sat alone at her kitchen table. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside her. The lamp burned low. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. She looked around the room, the shelves she built, the table she repaired, the small home she had created with her own hands. Then she thought about Caleb's ranch, the men who worked there, the years he spent building it, the respect he had earned. And suddenly, a thought she hated appeared. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was becoming a burden. The next morning, Caleb found her at the ranch gate. She had come to return a basket. He noticed immediately. Something was different. You all right? Nora looked at him. I think I should visit less. His face changed. Why? She looked toward the fields. Because people are talking. Let them. It's easy for you to say. The words came out sharper than she intended. Caleb went quiet. Nora looked down. I'm sorry. He shook his head. No. A pause. You don't have to apologize for being hurt. That made her look back at him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Caleb reached for the basket. Not taking it from her, just holding the handle with her. A small gesture, a quiet reminder. You are not a problem I need to solve, Nora. Her eyes met his. You believe that? Yes. The answer came without hesitation, but she still looked uncertain. And Caleb realized something. The town's words had reached places his own words had not, because Nora Whitfield had spent a lifetime believing she had to earn her place. And Samuel Reed had just reminded her of every reason she once felt she did not belong. Caleb watched her ride away that afternoon. And for the first time in years, he felt something stronger than loneliness. He felt anger, not the kind that made a man reckless, the kind that came from seeing someone good being made to question her own worth. And far away in town, Samuel Reed opened another letter, a business offer, a proposal, a plan. He looked toward the mountains where the Dawson Ranch stood. Then he smiled, because he knew the hardest battles were not always fought with guns or money. Sometimes, all a man had to do was convince someone they were not enough. Caleb Dawson had spent years facing storms, real storms, the kind that turned mountain roads into mud and buried fence posts beneath snow. The kind that forced a man to ride before sunrise just to make sure his cattle survived another night. Those storms were easier. You could see them coming. You could prepare. You could build stronger fences and stack more firewood. But watching Nora Whitfield quietly step away because she believed she was becoming a burden was something Caleb had no answer for. For several days after their conversation at the ranch gate, Nora did exactly what she said she would do. She came less often. She sent bread through the ranch hands instead of bringing it herself. She stopped riding out to check the lower fields. She stopped sitting on the porch in the evenings when Caleb returned from the pastures. Nothing dramatic happened. That was what bothered him most. Nora did not leave angry. She did not accuse him. She simply made herself smaller, and Caleb hated that more than any argument. One afternoon, He found a basket sitting near the front steps of the ranch house. Inside were fresh rolls, a small jar of jam, and a note. The handwriting was neat. Mr. Dawson, I hope these help with the long days. Thank you for your kindness. Caleb read it twice, then he folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. The words were polite, too polite. The same woman who once stood beside his pasture fence telling him the truth about his land was now writing like a stranger. That evening, Caleb rode into town. The sky was darkening over the mountains. A cold wind moved through Red Creek, carrying the smell of coming snow. He found Nora outside that general store, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. Nora, she stopped. Caleb, the distance in her voice bothered him, not because she sounded angry, because she sounded careful. You have been avoiding the ranch. She looked down. I have been giving you space. I didn't ask for space. She looked back at him. Maybe you should have. The words surprised him, not because they were cruel, because they were honest. Caleb removed his gloves. Is that what you think? Nora looked toward the empty street. I think people are talking because of me. No, it is true. No. The firmness in his voice made her look at him. Caleb lowered his tone. People talked before you ever stepped onto my land. She was quiet. They talked about my being alone. They talked about my choices. They talked because talking is easier than understanding. The wind moved between them. But now they are talking about you. Caleb watched her carefully, and that bothers you. Nora gave a small, tired smile. Wouldn't it bother you? He did not answer immediately, because he knew the truth. Yes, it bothered him, not because of what people thought, because Nora believed them. You think I see you as a problem. Her eyes lowered. I don't know what to think. That answer stayed with him. A woman who had spent her life being ignored was now standing in front of the first person who noticed her, afraid that noticing her had come at a cost. Before Caleb could say more, a sharp wind came down from the mountains. Snow began falling, small at first, then heavier. By morning, the road toward the ranch was covered. The winter storm arrived faster than expected, the kind of storm that changed plans without asking. Caleb was checking the northern fence line when the snow became too thick to see the trail clearly. He turned his horse back toward the ranch. The wind pushed hard against him. By the time he reached the main house, his coat was covered with snow. He expected an empty kitchen. Instead, he found Nora standing near the stove. She turned when he entered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she looked at his coat. You should get that off before it freezes. Caleb stared. You came here? Nora looked away. Margaret asked me to bring supplies. She thought the storm might trap you here without enough food. Caleb closed the door behind him. And you stayed? She glanced toward the window. The road was already too bad. Outside, the snow covered the valley. The world beyond the glass had disappeared into white. For the first time in days, Caleb and Nora were in the same room without the weight of town between them. The cabin was quiet. The stove crackled. A coffee pot sat warming near the fire. Nora removed her coat and hung it near the door. Caleb noticed something. She moved around the cabin differently now, carefully, like she was afraid of taking up too much space. That bothered him. More than he expected. You don't have to do that. She looked over. Do what? Act like you don't belong here. Her expression changed slightly. I never said that. You didn't have to. The room became quiet. Nora looked down at her hands. I have spent my whole life knowing when I was not wanted. Caleb said nothing. She continued. When people need help, they find me. When something needs fixing, they call me. But there is a difference between being useful and being chosen. The fire popped softly. Caleb looked at her. Really looked. Not the way the town looked. Not measuring, not judging, just seeing. Nora. She lifted her eyes. You think I asked you to dance because I felt sorry for you? She looked away. I don't know. Caleb stepped closer to the table, then listen. His voice was quiet. I asked because when I walked into that room, you were the only person who looked like they weren't trying to impress anyone. Nora said nothing. You were standing there alone, but you weren't begging anyone to notice you. He paused. I noticed anyway. Her eyes softened. The storm continued outside. For hours they talked. Not like strangers, not like two people pretending they had no feelings. They talked about things they had avoided. Caleb spoke about the years after losing his wife. Not every detail. Just enough. The empty rooms, the meals eaten alone, the habit of leaving one chair untouched because changing the room felt too much like admitting something was gone. Nora listened. She did not interrupt. She did not offer simple answers. She just listened. Then she spoke about herself. About growing up feeling like she had to earn kindness. About learning to accept being overlooked because expecting more only led to disappointment. Caleb looked at her across the small table. Who told you that you weren't enough? Nora gave a faint smile. Nobody said it all at once. She looked toward the window. Sometimes people say things without words. Caleb understood, because he had done the same. He had built a life around silence. He had told himself he was strong because he needed no one. But sitting there beside Nora, listening to the wind outside, he wondered if he had simply been afraid. The fire burned lower. The storm continued. Finally, Caleb reached across the table, not quickly, not expecting anything. He simply placed his hand near hers. An offer, a question. Nora looked down, then back at him. For a moment, neither moved. Then she placed her hand beside his, not holding tightly, just enough. A quiet agreement. Caleb looked at her, and the words came before he could stop them. Nora, yes, you were worth seeing before I ever looked. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. Outside, the snow covered the mountain roads. Inside, the small ranch house that had once held only one person's silence felt different. Not because the storm ended, not because the world outside changed, because two people who had spent years protecting themselves had finally stopped standing so far apart. And neither of them knew that when the snow melted, the hardest challenge would not come from the weather. It would come from the truth waiting above them in the attic. A forgotten letter, a hidden piece of history, and a secret that would change the way they both saw Nora Whitfield forever. The winter storm passed after 3 days. When the clouds finally broke, Red Creek woke beneath a blanket of snow. The mountains stood bright beneath the morning sun. Thin streams of smoke rose from chimneys across the valley. Horses stepped carefully through the frozen ground, their hooves leaving dark marks along the packed snow. At the Dawson Ranch, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The fences needed checking, the cattle needed feeding, the paths around the barn needed clearing. But something inside the house had changed. Not the furniture, not the walls, not the old wooden floors that creaked whenever someone crossed the room. Something quieter, something that neither Caleb nor Nora spoke about. Before the storm, the ranch house had felt like a place where two people happened to exist. After those long days beside the fire, it felt like a home waiting to become something more. Nora still woke early. She still prepared coffee before Caleb came in from checking the animals. She still folded blankets neatly and kept supplies organized. But now Caleb noticed the small things. The way she hummed while working, the way she left a clean towel near the wash basin when she knew he would return covered in dust and snow. The way she always saved the last piece of bread because she knew he liked the crust. None of it was grand. That was what made it matter. Caleb had spent years surrounded by things that could be counted. Acres, cattle, money, But Nora reminded him that the things worth keeping were often the things nobody wrote down. A week after the storm, Margaret arrived at the ranch with a bundle of letters and supplies from town. She stepped inside, removed her gloves, and looked around. Her eyes moved from Caleb to Nora, then to the 2 coffee mugs sitting beside the stove. A small smile appeared. "I see the storm did not hurt this place." Caleb looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means the house looks less empty." Nora lowered her eyes, hiding a smile. Caleb pretended not to notice. Margaret handed him the mail. 1 letter from the feed supplier, 1 from the bank. Caleb nodded. Then Margaret looked toward Nora. "And 1 old box from your farmhouse." Nora looked confused. "My farmhouse?" Margaret reached into the wagon and pulled out a small wooden box covered in dust. "I was helping move some things before the snow came. This was hidden behind a loose board in the attic." Nora stepped closer. "I don't remember that being there. Your father probably placed it there." The mention of her father changed the room. Nora touched the edge of the box. Her father had been gone for many years. Most memories had faded into small pieces: the smell of his coat after working outside, the sound of his boots on the porch, the way he always checked the weather before planting. But there were things she no longer remembered clearly, like his voice, like his handwriting. She carried the box to the table. Caleb watched quietly. He knew some doors were not meant to be opened by force, only by trust. Nora lifted the lid. Inside were old papers, a few faded photographs, a small pocket knife, and several folded letters tied together with worn string. She picked up the first letter. The paper was yellow with age. The name written on the front made her stop. Caleb Dawson. Caleb looked up. "My name?" Nora nodded slowly. She carefully opened the letter. The handwriting was old, but clear. "Dear William Dawson, I know you will not accept payment for what happened last winter, but I cannot allow kindness to disappear without being remembered. Your family helped mine years ago. When your cattle were lost and the winter was hard, you gave my father supplies without asking for anything in return. Now I have the chance to return that kindness. Take this money and use it to keep your ranch. A man's land is not just dirt and fences. It is the work of his hands and the people who believe in him." Thomas Whitfield. Nora stopped reading. She looked at Caleb. "My father wrote this?" Caleb reached for the letter carefully. His eyes moved across the page. His expression changed. "My father." He looked toward the window. "My father never told me." Nora unfolded another paper. This one was a receipt from a local bank, a payment, years earlier, a payment that helped keep the Dawson Ranch from being sold. Caleb sat down slowly. All his life, he believed his father had saved the ranch alone, through hard work, through sacrifice, through stubbornness. But the truth was different. Someone had stood beside him, someone who never asked for recognition. Nora looked at the documents. "My father never talked about this." Caleb shook his head. "Neither did mine." The room became quiet, not uncomfortable, just full. Full of things that had been hidden for too long. Later that afternoon, Caleb and Nora rode into Red Creek to speak with Judge Henry Wallace. The judge lived above the old courthouse. He was nearly 70 years old, with silver hair and a habit of keeping every important document in carefully labeled drawers. When Caleb placed the papers on his desk, the old judge adjusted his glasses. "I wondered if these would ever be found." Nora looked at him. "You knew?" Judge Wallace nodded. "I handled some of the records when your father helped the Dawson family." She stared at him. "Why did nobody tell me?" The judge looked down. "Because your father asked us not to." "Why?" "Because he believed helping someone was not something a person should do for praise." Nora was silent. Judge Wallace continued. "Your family was respected in this valley, Nora, before circumstances changed, before people forgot." The words reached deeper than she expected. For years, She had listened to people describe her as if her life had started with hardship, as if she had always been someone who needed pity. But the truth was different. Her family had given, her family had helped, her family had mattered. Caleb looked at Nora. He saw her holding the letter with both hands, not tightly, carefully, like she was holding a piece of herself she had lost. On the ride back to the ranch, they said little. The snow beneath the horses' hooves made a soft rhythm. Finally, Caleb spoke. All these years, Nora looked at him. What? You thought you had to prove yourself? She looked away. I suppose I did. Caleb held the reins loosely. You never needed to. Nora was quiet. The mountains stretched around them, the same mountains that had watched families come and go for generations. The town forgot, she said softly. Caleb looked at her, but I didn't. She turned. For a moment, neither spoke, because they both understood something had changed, not just how Caleb saw Nora, how Nora saw herself. That evening, Nora placed the old letters on the small table near her bed. She read them again before sleeping, not because she needed proof, but because for the first time in years, she wanted to remember. The next morning, the people of Red Creek still had their opinions. The whispers had not disappeared. Samuel Reed still had his plans. The town still judged what it did not understand. But Nora Whitfield was no longer carrying the same weight. She had spent years believing she was the woman nobody chose. Now she knew something the town had forgotten. She came from people who had always chosen kindness, and kindness had a way of surviving longer than gossip. For the first time in many years, Nora Whitfield walked through Red Creek without feeling as though she needed to apologize for taking up space. The town had not changed. The same wooden sidewalks lined Main Street. The same horses stood tied outside the general store. The same voices gathered near the diner every morning with coffee cups warming their hands. People still watched. People still whispered. But Nora heard those whispers differently now. They no longer sounded like the truth. They sounded like noise. The old letters from her father stayed wrapped in cloth inside the top drawer of her bedroom table. She did not carry them everywhere. She did not need to. Knowing was enough. Her family had not been a burden. Her name had not been something to hide. And Caleb Dawson had been the first person in years to see the person behind the rumors. That should have been enough to make life easier. But Samuel Reed had no intention of letting things become easy. A week after Judge Wallace confirmed the old documents, Samuel invited Caleb to his ranch office. The invitation came on thick paper, not a simple note, not a request, a statement. Samuel Reed was the kind of man who believed the right words written on the right paper could make any situation look official. Caleb almost ignored it, but Margaret convinced him to go. You need to know what he wants, she said. Caleb stood near the doorway, putting on his coat. I already know what he wants. Then why go? Because sometimes a man shows his hand when he thinks he has already won. Margaret studied him. Be careful. Caleb looked at her. I always am. She shook her head, not with land, a pause. With your heart. Caleb said nothing, but he understood. The Reed Ranch sat on a wide stretch of open country east of Red Creek. The buildings were larger than most ranches in the territory. The barn had been painted recently, the fences were straight, the horses were well kept. Everything about Samuel Reed's property showed success. Caleb stepped inside the office just before noon. Samuel stood behind a large wooden desk. 2 cups of coffee sat between them. Samuel gestured toward the chair. Sit. Caleb remained standing. Samuel smiled slightly, still stubborn. That was one thing he respected about Caleb. Even when they disagreed, Caleb never pretended. I'll get straight to the point. Caleb said nothing. Samuel opened a folder. Inside were papers, business agreements, financial documents, maps. I am prepared to offer you a partnership. Caleb looked down. With you? With Reed Cattle Company. Samuel leaned back. You have good land, good cattle, But every ranch owner knows the same thing. What? One bad year can take everything. Caleb's expression remained unchanged. You think I don't know that? I think you have forgotten. Samuel tapped the papers. This agreement would protect your ranch. Caleb glanced at the documents. What is the price? Samuel smiled. I knew you would ask. He removed another paper. A marriage arrangement. The room became quiet. Caleb did not move. Samuel continued. My daughter has been raised properly. She understands ranch life. She understands reputation. Caleb looked at him. And Nora? Samuel did not answer immediately. That was enough. Caleb picked up his coat. No. Samuel looked surprised. You haven't even considered it. I have. You are willing to risk your entire future? Caleb stopped at the door. My future is not a business contract. Samuel's face hardened slightly. You should think carefully. Caleb turned. About what? About whether one person is worth losing everything. Caleb held his gaze. Then he walked out. The news traveled quickly. It always did. By evening, Red Creek knew Samuel Reed had offered Caleb Dawson a way to secure his ranch. By morning, people had already created their own version of what happened. Some said Caleb was foolish. Some said Nora had distracted him. Some said love was something a man could afford only after his responsibilities were finished. Nora heard pieces of it while buying supplies at the general store. She stood near the counter holding a list of items: flour, salt, coffee, needles, simple things. Behind her, two women spoke quietly. Samuel's offer would save that ranch. Yes, and he might throw it away because of her. Nora stopped. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. She paid for the supplies. The storekeeper handed her the receipt. Miss Whitfield. She looked up. Yes? He hesitated. Don't let people decide your worth. The kindness surprised her. She nodded. Thank you. Outside, she stood near her wagon for a long moment. The winter air was cold. Her hands tightened around the paper bag. For years, she had dreamed of being chosen, but she had never dreamed of being the reason someone lost something important. That thought stayed with her. That night at the Dawson Ranch, Caleb found Nora sitting on the porch. The sunset had already disappeared behind the mountains. A lantern burned beside her. You heard? She looked up. Yes. Caleb sat beside her. The space between them was quiet, not empty, just heavy. I rejected him. Nora looked toward the fields. I know. He wanted me to marry someone else. I know. Caleb studied her. And you think I should have accepted? She did not answer. That told him enough. Nora, she folded her hands. I don't want to be the reason you lose your ranch. Caleb looked at her. You aren't. But people are saying, I don't care what people are saying. She looked down. I do. The honesty surprised him. Nora took the breath. Your ranch is your family's work, your father's work, your whole life. Caleb said nothing, and I came into it recently. The words were quiet, too quiet. I don't want you to wake up one day and wonder if choosing me was a mistake. Caleb looked away, because for the first time he understood what Samuel Reed had been trying to do. He was not trying to convince Caleb. He was trying to make Nora convince herself. Nora. She looked at him. You think I chose you because I needed someone? Her eyes moved slightly. No. Then why? She did not answer. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When I lost everything that mattered, I built a life where nobody could leave. The wind moved across the valley, and then you came along. Nora's eyes softened. You didn't fix my life. He looked at her. You reminded me I had one. For a moment, she almost smiled. Almost, but the fear remained, because love was not always the hardest thing to find. Sometimes the hardest thing was believing it could stay. 3 days later, Nora made her decision. She packed quietly, a few dresses, her sewing supplies, her father's letters, the small things that belonged only to her. She left before sunrise, no note, no goodbye. Not because she stopped caring, because she cared too much. She believed Caleb deserved a future without having to fight the entire world for her. And as her wagon rolled away from the Dawson ranch, Caleb stood near the barn door holding the coffee mug she had given him weeks earlier. The house behind him was warm, the cattle were safe, the ranch was still standing. But something was missing, something he had not expected to lose. Nora, and for the first time since the day he buried his old life and chose solitude, Caleb Dawson felt the same empty silence return. Only this time, he knew exactly what was missing. The ranch had not changed. That was the part Caleb could not understand. The fences still stood, the cattle still moved across the valley. The morning sun still touched the mountain peaks the same way it always had. Everything around him looked exactly as it had before, but the house felt different. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made a man notice every small sound, the ticking of the old clock above the fireplace, the scrape of his boots across the wooden floor, the empty second chair at the kitchen table. Caleb had lived alone for years. He knew silence. He had chosen it. But this was not the same. Before Nora, the silence had been familiar. After Nora, it felt like something had been taken away. Every morning, he found himself looking toward the doorway. Every evening, he expected to hear footsteps near the porch. A small part of him kept waiting for her to return, but the road remained empty. Nora had gone back to the old Whitfield property several miles outside Red Creek. The farmhouse had belonged to her family before hard times forced them to leave. The building was smaller than she remembered. The paint had faded, the porch boards needed repair, the garden behind the house had grown wild. But it was still familiar. A place where nobody whispered, a place where nobody looked at her and wondered if she belonged. She spent the first days cleaning. That was what she knew. She swept the floors, opened the windows, repaired the loose shutters. She washed old dishes that had sat untouched for years. The work filled the hours. It kept her from thinking. But at night, when the lantern burned low, there was nowhere to hide from her own thoughts. The old letters from her father sat beside her bed. The same letters that had shown her she came from a family that gave her instead of took. The same letters that had made her feel stronger. Yet now she wondered if strength meant knowing when to leave, because she loved Caleb. That was the truth she could no longer avoid. But loving someone did not always mean staying. Sometimes it meant stepping away before you became the reason they lost everything. At least, that was what she told herself. Back at the Dawson Ranch, Margaret watched her brother change. Not dramatically. Caleb was not the kind of man who broke down or complained. That was never who he had been. Instead, he became quieter. He worked longer. He spoke less. One morning, Margaret found him repairing the same section of fence he had already fixed twice. She leaned against the post. That fence was repaired yesterday. Caleb continued hammering. I know. Then why are you fixing it again? He stopped. For a moment, he looked at the fence, then at the empty valley beyond it. I missed a spot. Margaret studied him. No, you didn't. Caleb lowered the hammer. She walked closer. You are not fixing the fence. He said nothing. You are keeping yourself busy because you don't want to think. The wind moved across the field. Finally, Caleb placed the hammer down. I should have stopped her. Margaret's expression softened. Yes, he looked surprised. You agree? I do. Caleb looked away. But I also know Nora. Margaret adjusted her gloves. She did not leave because she stopped caring. Caleb said nothing. She left because she believed staying would hurt you. That was the hardest part, because Caleb understood. He understood exactly why she had gone, and that made it worse. A week later, Caleb rode into Red Creek, not because he needed supplies, not because he had business, because he needed to know where Nora was. He found her at the old farmhouse. She was repairing a wooden shutter when she saw him approach. For a moment, neither moved. The distance between them felt larger than the miles between the ranch and the house. Nora. Caleb, he removed his hat. She noticed the tired look in his eyes. You shouldn't have come. Why? She looked down. Because it makes this harder. Caleb stepped closer. Harder for who? She did not answer. That was answer enough. He looked at the porch. You left. I know. You didn't say goodbye. I didn't know how. The honesty in her voice stopped him. Nora placed the hammer down. I knew what Samuel was offering. Caleb shook his head. That wasn't a choice. It was... No, his voice was stronger now. He wanted me to trade my life for a business deal. Nora looked at him. What if the business failed? The question surprised him. She continued. What if one winter comes that is worse than expected? What if the cattle struggle again? What if people blame me? Caleb stared at her. Nora, I have spent my whole life being the thing people tolerate until something better comes along. The words were quiet, but they carried years behind them. Caleb took a breath. You are not that. I know what you say. Then believe it. She looked away. I am trying. That answer hurt more than anger would have, because he knew she meant it. The following days passed slowly. Caleb returned to the ranch. Nora stayed at the farmhouse. Neither moved forward, neither truly moved away. They were two people standing on opposite sides of the same road, both wanting the other to cross, neither willing to force it. Then one afternoon, Judge Henry Wallace arrived at the Dawson Ranch. Caleb was surprised to see him. Judge, the older man removed his hat. Caleb, they stood near the barn. I heard about Samuel Reed's offer. Caleb's expression changed. News travels. It does. The judge looked toward the mountains. You know, your father was not a man who accepted help easily. Caleb listened. He spent years believing strength meant carrying everything alone. The words struck him, because they sounded familiar. Judge Wallace continued. Then Thomas Whitfield helped him. Caleb looked down. And my father learned that accepting kindness was not weakness. The judge paused. Maybe you need to learn the same lesson. Caleb looked toward the road leading to Nora. For years, he believed love was something that made a person vulnerable, something that created another thing to lose. But Nora had not weakened him. She had changed the way he saw his own life. Without her, the ranch still stood, but the home was gone. That evening, Caleb entered the empty house. He walked to the kitchen. The coffee mugs sat on the shelf. Two of them. One he had used for years. One Nora had brought from her farmhouse. He picked up hers, held it for a moment, then carefully placed it back. A small smile touched his face, not because he was happy, because he finally understood. The man who spent years protecting himself from loss had spent years losing something already. Not land, not money, not reputation, a chance. A chance to build a life with someone who saw him before the world saw his success. The next morning, Caleb Dawson saddled his horse. He tightened the reins, checked the gate, and looked toward the road leading away from the ranch. He was not riding to protect what he owned. He was riding to fight for what he almost lost. The road from the Dawson Ranch to Red Creek had never seemed so long. Caleb Dawson had ridden it hundreds of times. He knew every bend, every rise in the trail, every section where the ground became softer after rain. But that morning, every mile felt different. The mountains stood behind him, covered with the last traces of winter snow. The valley stretched wide beneath the pale morning sky. His horse moved steadily beneath him, the sound of hooves against frozen earth keeping time with his thoughts. For years, Caleb believed a man proved himself by what he could carry alone. The weight of a ranch, the responsibility of workers, the memory of the family he lost. He had built walls around his life and called them strength. Then Nora Whitfield walked through those walls without trying. She did not demand a place. She did not ask to be chosen. She simply stood beside him. And somehow, that had been enough to change everything. Caleb reached Red Creek just after sunrise. The town was already awake. The bakery ovens were warming. The general store owner was sweeping the wooden sidewalk. A wagon loaded with supplies rolled past the courthouse. People noticed Caleb immediately. They always did. But this time, he did not slow down because of their attention. He tied his horse outside the bank and walked inside. Samuel Reed looked up from behind his desk. The surprise on his face lasted only a moment. Then it disappeared. Caleb, Samuel. The room was quiet. A clock ticked on the wall. A stack of documents sat beside Samuel's coffee cup. The same kind of documents Caleb had refused weeks earlier. I assume you came to reconsider? Caleb stood straight. No, Samuel leaned back. Then why are you here? Caleb placed his gloves on the desk. Because you made a mistake. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Did I? You thought the only thing I cared about was the ranch. Samuel smiled slightly. Most men would. Most men would be wrong. The smile faded. Leb looked toward the papers. You offered me a way to save my land by asking me to abandon the person who helped save it. Samuel folded his hands. You are letting emotion cloud your judgment. No. Caleb shook his head. For years, I let fear make my decisions. The words surprised even Samuel. Caleb continued. I thought keeping people away meant I couldn't lose them. A pause. But all it meant was that I never let myself have anything worth keeping. Samuel looked at him carefully. You really believe she is worth all this? Caleb did not hesitate. Yes, the answer came so quickly that Samuel had no response. Caleb picked up his gloves. You wanted me to choose between my future and Nora. He walked toward the door. The truth is, she is part of the future I want. By noon, everyone in Red Creek knew Caleb Dawson was back, and they knew why. The news spread quickly. Samuel Reed had made his offer. Caleb had refused. Now people gathered near the courthouse, the general store, and the diner, waiting to see what would happen next. Because in a small town, a man's choices became everyone's conversation. Nora heard about it from Clara. She was outside the old farmhouse repairing a garden fence when her cousin arrived. Nora, she looked up. Clara, her cousin, stepped down from the wagon. There was something different in her expression, not uncertainty, not judgment, something closer to regret. Caleb went to see Samuel. Nora lowered the hammer. Why? Clara looked at her. Because of you. Nora looked away. Clara. No. Her cousin shook her head. I need to say this. The wind moved through the dry grass. I was wrong. Nora looked surprised. Clara continued. I listened to people who never took the time to know you. She glanced toward the farmhouse. You spent years helping everyone in this town, and I was one of the people who forgot. Nora softened. Clara, I am sorry. The apology was simple but honest. Nora placed the hammer down. Thank you. They stood quietly for a moment. Then Clara said, He's coming here. Nora looked toward the road. And there he was, Caleb Dawson, riding toward the farmhouse. When Caleb reached the property, Nora stood waiting near the porch. He climbed down from his horse. Neither spoke immediately. There were too many things between them. Too many words left unsaid. Finally, Caleb removed his hat. I should have come sooner. Nora looked down. Maybe. The answer was gentle, but true. He nodded. I should have told you that Samuel's offer did not matter. You did. Not clearly enough. A silence passed, the same kind of silence they once shared beside the fire, but now it carried different weight. "I was afraid," Nora admitted. Caleb looked at her. "I know. I thought one day you would wake up and realize choosing me had cost you everything." Caleb stepped closer. "Nora," she looked at him. "You still don't understand." He paused. "I did not lose anything by choosing you." The wind moved around them. The ranch is still there. The cattle are still there. The land is still there. His voice lowered. "But the man I was before you came here was not living." Nora's eyes softened. "He was surviving." Caleb nodded. "Yes." For a moment, neither moved. Then Caleb reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded paper. Nora looked at it. "What is that?" "Something I should have said a long time ago." He unfolded it. "Not a contract, not a business agreement, a simple letter. I wrote this last night." Nora looked at him. "You wrote me a letter?" Caleb almost smiled. "I am better with paper than words." A small smile appeared on her face. He handed it to her. She read the first lines. "I don't need someone who makes my life easier. I need someone who makes my life meaningful." Her fingers tightened slightly around the page. Caleb continued, "I cannot promise the town will stop talking." Nora looked up. "I cannot promise every season will be easy." A pause. "But I can promise I will never again let other people's opinions decide what matters to me." The emotion in Nora's face was quiet, not dramatic, not sudden, just a person finally hearing the words she had waited years to believe. "I don't want to be saved," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "I know. I don't want to be someone you protect because you feel sorry for me. I know. Then what do you want?" Caleb looked at her. "The woman who stood beside my ranch when everyone else only saw my problems." A long silence followed. Then Nora stepped forward. Not because the world changed, not because the town approved, because she believed him. That afternoon, Caleb and Nora returned to Red Creek together. Not hidden, not avoiding anyone, together. They stopped outside the courthouse where several townspeople had gathered. Samuel Reed stood near the steps. Caleb looked at him, then at everyone watching. For years, Caleb Dawson had avoided attention. That day, he stepped into it. "Nora Whitfield saved my ranch." The words carried through the street. People became quiet. She saw problems I refused to see. She helped when nobody asked her to. She stood beside me when it was easier to walk away. He looked at Nora. The woman this town underestimated was the person who reminded me what mattered. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. Not this time. Samuel Reed watched silently because he had lost the one thing he counted on. The town's belief that Nora was less than she was. Caleb took Nora's hand, not as a symbol, not as a performance, just because he wanted to. And for the first time, Red Creek saw what Caleb had known for months. Nora Whitfield had never needed someone to prove her worth. She only needed someone brave enough to stand beside it. And Caleb Dawson had done exactly that. But the people of Red Creek soon learned something important. A single moment could change the way a town looked at someone. But a lifetime of kindness was what truly changed the way people remembered them. The weeks after Caleb stood beside Nora in front of the courthouse were different. Not perfect, not suddenly free of judgment. Small towns did not change overnight. People who spent years believing one thing did not wake up one morning and forget every opinion they had ever held. But they watched, and slowly they noticed. They noticed that Nora did not walk through town expecting special treatment. She still helped Mrs. Carter carry groceries from the store. She still brought food to families who were struggling through the winter. She still stopped to speak with children who ran through the streets with muddy boots and scraped knees. Nothing about her changed. Except now people were finally paying attention. At the Dawson Ranch, Life settled into a new rhythm, a good rhythm, the kind that came from two people learning each other's habits. Caleb still woke before sunrise. He still checked the fences. He still walked the pastures before breakfast. But now there was another coffee mug beside his on the kitchen table, another pair of boots near the door, another voice asking questions about the day ahead. Sometimes Caleb would return from the fields and find Nora sitting near the window, sorting seeds for the spring garden. Sometimes she would look up and ask, "How was the northern pasture?" And Caleb would answer, not because he needed to report every detail, because he wanted to share his day with someone. That was something he had forgotten how to do. Share, not carry. Spring arrived slowly in Red Creek. The snow melted from the mountains. The creek began running stronger. New grass appeared across the valley. The Dawson Ranch recovered more than anyone expected. The cattle were healthier, the pastures were stronger, and the workers who had once questioned Nora's place now respected her without hesitation. Walter Briggs was one of the first to admit it. He stood near the barn one afternoon watching Nora inspect a damaged fence post. "Never thought I would see the day." Caleb looked over. "See what?" "Woman telling ranch hands how to fix a fence." Caleb smiled slightly. "She is not telling them." Walter nodded. "That is why they listen." Nora looked over when she heard them. "What are you two discussing?" Walter adjusted his hat. "Nothing important." Nora looked at Caleb. "That usually means it is something important." Caleb laughed quietly, a sound that still surprised people who had known him for years, because Caleb Dawson had changed, not into someone else, into someone who finally allowed himself to be seen. By autumn, Red Creek prepared for another harvest festival, the same wooden dance hall, the same lanterns hanging from the posts. A year had passed since the night Nora stood alone against the wall while everyone else danced. A year since Benjamin Reed told her some women were not meant to be chosen. A year since Caleb Dawson walked across that room and offered his hand. This time, when Nora entered the dance hall, people noticed, but not because they were waiting to see who would ignore her. They noticed because they were glad she was there. Margaret Dawson stood beside her as they entered. "You remember this place?" Nora smiled. "How could I forget?" Margaret looked around. Funny how things change. Nora looked at the dance floor. Some things do. Before Margaret could answer, the musicians began playing. The room filled with movement. Couples stepped forward. Children ran between tables. The smell of fresh bread and roasted food filled the air. Then Nora saw him. Caleb, standing near the center of the room, waiting, not hidden near the doorway, not watching from a distance, waiting for her. He wore a clean dark coat and the same calm expression he always carried. But Nora knew him better now. She knew the small changes, the softer look in his eyes, the way he held himself differently when she was near. He walked toward her. The room slowly became quieter, not because people expected something embarrassing, because they wanted to see. Caleb stopped in front of her. Then he offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" For a moment, Nora looked at his hand, the same gesture, a different life. Last year, she had wondered if accepting would make her foolish. Tonight, she already knew the answer. She placed her hand in his. "Yes." They stepped onto the floor. The music began, and the same room that once made Nora feel invisible now watched her dance with the man who had chosen her when nobody else would. Near the back of the hall, Benjamin Reed stood quietly. He was older, less certain. The confidence he once carried so easily had faded. He watched Nora laugh softly as Caleb said something only she could hear. Then he looked away. Some lessons came too late. Years later, people in Red Creek would tell the story differently. Some would say Caleb Dawson was the lucky one. Some would say Nora changed the ranch. Some would say their love was the reason the Dawson property became one of the most respected ranches in the valley. But the people who truly knew them understood something simpler. Caleb did not choose Nora because she needed someone. He chose her because she had spent her whole life standing strong without anyone choosing her. And Nora did not love Caleb because he was a wealthy ranch owner. She loved him because beneath the reputation, beneath the land and the success, she found a man who had been waiting for someone to remind him that life was meant to be shared. The town once believed Nora Whitfield would never find love. They were wrong. She had always been worthy of it. She had simply been waiting for someone brave enough to see. And maybe that is the part of Nora Whitfield's story that stays with us the longest. Not the dance, not the rumors, not even the moment Caleb Dawson stood in front of the whole town and chose her. It was the quiet truth underneath it all. Imagine standing where Nora stood, carrying years of doubt, wondering if anyone could ever see beyond what the world noticed first. Imagine believing you had to earn every kindness, every place at the table, every chance to be loved. Then imagine finding someone who does not ask you to become someone else, but simply recognizes the person you already are. That is the kind of love that heals old wounds, the kind built not on perfection, but on patience, loyalty, and two people brave enough to open their hearts again. Nora's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is not saving them, but truly seeing them. What moment from Nora and Caleb's story touched your heart the most? Share it with us in the comments. And if you enjoy stories of love, healing, second chances, and unforgettable journeys from the past, consider subscribing. There are many more heartfelt stories waiting for you in the videos ahead.